Today we are focusing on 10 tips to improve your resume. So what I tried to do today was try to capture easy things, easy changes that you can make today, as it were, that would have perhaps a good impact on the resume that you're making. Resumes are documents that require a lot of thought and attention as you're trying to position yourself for different opportunities. So we're not going to cover everything that's critical to the resume, but as we get through this, hopefully you'll see that there are things that you can do right now that will have an impact. I am Dr. Joseph Barber. I'm the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives here at Penn's Career Services. So let's jump straight in. We have 10 things to cover, short period of time. And if you have questions, as I said, pop them in the chat. The first thing is to think about what you actually want your resume to say. So when people come into a one-on-one advising session with me with their resume, one of the first questions that I often ask is, having read this, what do you want me, the reader, to take away from this? And sometimes, I sort of get quizzical looks and people are like, well, I don't know, right? Or well, I have experience and I have a good education background, right? So obviously education and experience are the two titles of the resume. They're not necessarily the takeaways. I think it's really important to figure out what you want the takeaways to be, because to a certain extent, if you don't know what you want the reader to take away, then you can't control what they do take away. They may take away something totally different from that resume because you haven't articulated a sort of a cohesive narrative as you are writing it, right? So it is important to have a takeaway that is more than just, well, I have great experience. So you have to think about what are the core experiences, skills, themes that you can sort of integrate throughout the resume. And it may only be a one-page resume, but you want to make sure that there's a coherent set of themes that the reader can take away and appreciate. Now, those themes obviously should be connected to the job and the organization that you're applying to. So you have to have done some of the background research to figure those things out. But I think it's nice to sort of, in your own mind, say, this is really what I want people to take away, right? If they took nothing else away from the resume, it would be these core skills or this experience that I think is helpful for the job. Now, as you're writing your resume, you can actually frame those up in actual, skills statements right at the top. If you have a summary of qualifications or a summary of skills, you can list some of those themes which represent the conclusions of the resume, right? So these are not from the same resume. These are just different examples of what I would consider to be a theme statement, excuse me, right at the top of the resume. What that basically does is it starts off the resume with a set of conclusions. You're basically saying to the reader, here's what I want you to take away. And then they read the resume and they can see these things. They can see these things come to life and they can see these things be important and be resonated by the specific examples that you're giving throughout the resume. So each of these feels broader than specific bullet points in the resume, right? These are not just single experiences. These are things that are the culmination of different experiences brought together. Skilled in managing extensive, highly variable health data sets isn't just one experience. It may have been something that you did as part of a course, something that you did as an intern, something that you did somewhere else, right? But that's the takeaway that you want the reader to know. And so you would state it in the summary of skill sets at the top. Enthusiastic problem solver with success in recommending and implementing innovative changes in teaching and communication approaches. So again, it doesn't really tell me at this point what you've done, but what it tells me is if I look through the resume, I should see illustrations of what that looks like. So just like with a scientific paper or any paper, I suppose, the conclusions are always drawn from real life experiences or they're drawn from the body of the document, right? So if you have a summary of skill sections or summary of qualifications at the top, those themes should be, they should be illustrated below in the experience section by more specific examples. So you can't just say you're an effective leader and then have no evidence of leadership in the rest of the document. That's just a sort of an empty statement. The other thing that a summary of qualifications allows you to do, you could put a job description there, extensive knowledge of this that you want to apply in this particular role. Naming the job is helpful sometimes. You can also put some forward-looking statements, passionate about the application of novel research to wearable technologies. And if you were applying for a role where that was what you were doing, then you get the word passion in there in the resume, which is oftentimes harder to do because it's a very dry document. So practice writing some of the summary of skill sections, even if you don't have one in your resume, because sometimes it's hard to fit a summary section in a one-page resume that's already quite full, but it's a good practice for you to be able to say, what are the takeaways? And make sure that once you've written them down somewhere else, you look for evidence of those throughout the rest of the resume. So that's my number one tip is think about writing your own summary statements first, just so that you know that those are the takeaways that the reader's going to get. Prioritizing skills and keywords is just a way to make it easier for the reader to see the things that are valuable and relevant to them, right? So this can be a really small change, easy to do. Here's an education section where someone has listed their thesis and listed their coursework, right? And a lot of coursework here, all great keywords that applicant tracking software will pull up, and that's great. But if the job said, they're looking for someone, the role itself is a sustainability analyst role, looking for GIS skills, then probably my recommendation for this section is to shift those courses to the beginning of that coursework section. So the reader, the human reader, is able to see them more easily, right? So obviously all that looks like is just moving the words around. So under coursework, the first thing I see are GIS and sustainability, right? They're not buried under 4 lines of other courses that I might be less excited by. So again, the keywords are going to be pulled out by the applicant tracking software. It doesn't care where you have them in the document, but the reader, the human, does care because they're reading through quickly and they really want things to jump off the page easily for them. Same with skills, right? People list their skills, software here, programming languages, fabrication things, and there's a whole bunch of skills. This is a perfectly good skill section. It lists the skills, easy to see them in as a sort of a grouping of skill sets, nicely framed up in different types of categories. But if the job says that they want C++ and SolidWorks as the required skills, then again, what I would do with those is I would take those and shift them to the front. So the human gets to see those first. Now, again, if they're most important to the job description, not only do you list them in the skills section here, you illustrate them in action in the experience section. You show how you use these tools in action and you list them in the skills section. So you sort of double up on those because they are required skills from the perspective of the job description. Some very easy changes to play around with that I think will make a difference. You can do the same with relevant experience too. So to a certain extent, if you're applying for a data-focused role in the tech industry, but data isn't necessarily, or tech-related roles aren't what you've done, but you've done data-related things, then you might want to prioritize the data stuff over the descriptions of what you've done, right? So performed image capturing of neurons in post-mortem tissue isn't something that you would necessarily bring with you to the tech industry, but filtering the data and organizing the data that you gain from that is. So in the experience section, that might mean reordering slightly the structure of the experience so that you're bringing to the forefront those first few bullet points are the most relevant to your reader, even though they may not be the most relevant to the work that you were doing, right? The data analysis may have only been, 10% of the work that you've been doing, but if that 10% is the most relevant to the reader, then give it a boost, prioritize it. Now, sometimes with these bullet points, it makes sense to have a sort of a slightly narrative form where you build knowledge of the role through each bullet point. So you may have to think about how to position your bullet points this way, but the general sense is prioritizing what the reader cares about the most, as opposed to what's most important to you, is the goal as you're going through this process. Formatting, people will give you different advice on what it needs to look like and how to do that. And I'm just going to share my thoughts on this for you, because obviously the document at the end of the day is your document and represents what you want it to look at, how you want it to look. And it can look many different ways, and each of those can be equally viable. My suggestion is just to make sure that there's room to breathe as you're reading through the resume. I know the challenge, especially if you're working towards a one-page resume, is to try to cram as much as possible in there. But if it's all crammed together so tightly that I can't actually sort of see the information at all, or can't appreciate that information or leverage that information, so making sure that you are thinking about the reader and helping them navigate through the document with enough space to appreciate what it is that you're actually saying. So what does that look like? What that looks like, the difference between the going through a sort of tick-infested swamp versus a tree-lined avenue with the breeze blowing through the wind, right? This is sort of the way that you should be thinking to a certain extent about the formatting of your document to make it readable. In terms of the resume, it means spacing. It means giving enough space to the things that you want to stand out so people can see that. Again, the applicant tracking software doesn't care how cramped it is or what size font it is, but the reader certainly does. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're trying to connect with the readers and the hiring managers. The one on the left, I feel, is too dense. The one in the middle, equally spaced throughout. It's hard to see the sections stick together. The one on the right is sort of my general suggestion, where you're being strategic in the way that things are spaced, right? There's bigger spaces between the main sections, education and relevant experience, and smaller spaces between the things within those sections, so that each section is somewhat distinct and tight, but there's enough space between them to see that. Again, at the end of the day, it's about what information you're trying to get into that one page, or a couple of pages, depending on the industry that you're applying to. So I appreciate the formatting challenge, but give some thought to spacing as part of that process. Graphical elements. People always, like to put graphical elements, especially in their content information line. Here's my phone, here's a picture of a phone, here's my phone number, here's my email, here's a picture of an email. I mean, everyone knows what a phone and email is right now, so I don't think you need that. And the challenge with graphical elements is that they can mess with the software that companies are using to sort of process the application materials, right? So if they are scanning materials, excuse me, and extracting that information so that they can put it in their own database and use their software to pull out the key skill sets, the more graphically complex your document is, the more likely the things aren't going to go quite right, or that information might be skipped, or whatever that is. So very, plain text in terms of how you're providing the content is sort of my recommendation. All of these icons over here, they look kind of good, but they're not going to be designy enough to make someone want to interview you, right? No one's going to look at your resume and go, wow, this is such a great design. I definitely want to make sure that we bring someone in, because that's not the purpose of the resume. The purpose of the resume is the content itself. So this, I would eliminate just those icons there because they'll get in the way. This is also something that I see a lot in resumes where people get to the skills section. They want to make it sort of dynamic and make it more interesting than just a list of words. Again, that adds complications to the software that's going to be processing your application eventually. But it's also like a report card, right? If I look at this one at the bottom with the circles filled, what my attention is drawn to is the things that you don't do so well, right? The things that have fewer dots. You can't use Grasshopper as well, right? And so it's like getting a 1 C and 15 A's in your report card. It's the C that stands out. So I don't think you need this. The other challenge is that your scale and my scale as the hiring manager may be totally different, right? You may say that you're not skilled at it, but I would say you're wonderfully skilled at it because we have no one else on my team who can do it, let's say. So I don't think it adds any value, and I think it just gets in the way. It takes up more space, and it gets in the way of really making sure that the information gets across. The best way to illustrate that you have competencies in these skills is to show them in action in the experience section. You use this tool to do this thing that resulted in this other thing. That's the best way of showing that action, of really helping the reader see that skill in action. And then once they are able to picture that skill in action, because you've given a sort of a mini story, they're able to imagine you using that skill for them more effectively. So my recommendation is not to have these graphical elements here. Talking about the bullet points, making sure that you structure these nicely with a skill that you're trying to showcase, some context to make that skill make sense, and then an outcome to demonstrate how effective that skill is. This is really how you want to try to structure each of the bullet points that are out there. The outcome is the thing that really allows you to say, look, it's not just me saying that my skill is good. Let me demonstrate how my skill is good, right? So I led a team of 3 people in a consulting club, and we got first place prize. The first place prize is the objective statement that says my leadership is effective. It's not just me saying I'm a good leader. My leadership is illustrated by the fact that we got this outcome. Now, you don't need an outcome for every bullet point that you're necessarily writing, and the outcome doesn't have to be a publication or saving the world or anything like that. It can be a small outcome, but I encourage you to think about whether there are outcomes that you can sort of point to in these bullet points. Now, the thing that I often look for in resumes when I'm doing reviews are these short 6 to 7 to 8 word bullet points, right? The half-line bullet points always jump out to me, because oftentimes what that means is that there's not enough information for me to understand the story or the skill in action, even though you, as the writer, really understand it. Because when you're writing down those 6 words and you read those 6 words, your brain fills in all the gaps. Your brain knows that you have what you did and when you did it and how exciting it was or how terrible it was or whatever it is. Your brain has all the story and all the context. But as the reader, I only have the words on the piece of paper. And so if you're looking through these sort of short bullet points here, it may be hard to imagine exactly what the reader's actually doing, right? Assisted with project logistics and analysis. I mean, there can be so many different things. It would be hard for me to go, oh, that's great, because assisted is not a direct word anyway, but then what does that actually look like? Engaged in outreach with local organizations and community. In what way? How successful was that? What did you do? What was that approach look like? So anytime that there's a sort of a short half-line bullet point, I encourage you to take a look at it and say, is there a takeaway that the reader can actually use from this? Can I make more of it? Do I actually need it, right? Graded papers and held office hours as a TA, for example, isn't something that's always transferable. Now you can change it, right? Use extensive knowledge of X to communicate to groups of 15 to 400 students and help them, manage their problems. You can make more of it, make it exciting, but you have to sort of make sure that you're translating those skills. So, in terms of examples, this might be a slightly better example, right? Designed and implemented new building condition identification and tracking system and became the go-to person in the office for this software application. The outcome here is being the go-to person. I now am an expert in this and I can teach other people. The skill is the designed and implemented. Synthesized data from these documents, developed a 2-hour training on a course for this project that will be given to 250 people annually via a live internet seminar. So again, the outcome is this will be something that will be used moving forward, right? So it's sort of a future focused outcome, but there's an outcome related to that. Modeled system on MATLAB, constructed balloon, awarded second place after maximizing balloon flight without reaching previously unknown height limits. Not entirely sure what that means because I took this from a sample, but the idea is the skill selling is the modeling the system on the MATLAB, and balloons doing exciting things that balloons do is the outcome related to that. So again, these are longer bullet points, but they're more illustrative, and I think that's going to be helpful as part of this process. Formatting. We've talked a little bit about formatting in terms of the spacing. So here's another thing to think about is just being consistent with formatting and making sure that the things that are most important stand out easily to the reader who's going to be looking at this fairly quickly as they go through this. So the one at the top is just a sample I pulled from one of the samples on our website. Penn is in bold, School of Engineering is not in bold, Philadelphia is in bold, the degrees in italics, everything else is in plain text. So to me, there's a lot of inconsistencies here. Why is Philadelphia in bold? Is that the most important thing that you want to see? Why isn't the degree in bold, right? That's pretty exciting to sort of be at the forefront. So my suggestion in terms of formatting, again, only a suggestion, not a thing that you have to do, is to sort of prioritize both in the placement and in the formatting of your material, of your content, to put the emphasis on what you want people to take away. Master of Science in Engineering, Bioengineering, University of Pennsylvania. Now, obviously, what I've done is I had to remove the School of Engineering and Applied Science. That's fine, so long as you have University of Pennsylvania. Maybe you want to include the school's name, in which case that's fine too. I was just giving you an example of a shorter version here where the things that are in bold are the degree and the institution. Things that are not bolded, the location and the date, because the location and the date are the least important parts, whereas the degree and the institution are the most important parts. Italics in general is harder to read when you're reading fast, right? It's a different formatting, so it stands out from plain text or bolded, but it's not as easy to jump out off the page as plain text or bolded text, at least in my experience. So my suggestion is not to italicize things that are important because it becomes harder to see those, but to bold the things that are important. There's also a difference between this font style that you want. I'm terrible at choosing font styles, but the main difference to think about is whether it's a font with serifs, the little things on the end, or one without, right? So the one at the top, if you look at the letters, they have the little sort of twiddles at the end of each of the letters. The one at the bottom is very flat, doesn't have any of those twiddly bits at the end. It's easier to cram in more text when you don't have those twiddly bits, is the way that people sort of talk about font sizes, right? So a plain sans serif font is likely to be more effective at being clearer when you're sort of condensing that into a resume. Dates, this is where I see a lot of inconsistencies in formatting. If you look at your dates in your resume now, probably some have a short hyphen, a big hyphen, some spaces, no spaces. Will anyone actually know or care about the hyphens between your dates? Well, that's debatable. I see them, they jump off the page at me. And if the job description needs you to have a keen attention to detail, then maybe someone will see that and go, well, this is a one-page document and there are inconsistencies. What are you going to do working on this giant programming thing that we're doing, or this designing this 400-story building that we want you to do, right? So if the job that you're applying to requires you to have a very keen attention to detail, but you can't do that or haven't done that in a resume, then that might be a reason that the human goes, this is not something that, this does not look good to me. This is not a good indication of the skills that you're bringing. Doesn't matter which one you choose, just be consistent throughout your document. This is a very straightforward recommendation. So this is the only bit of advice for number 7 is read your resume out loud, because it makes more sense and it will sound better if when you read it out loud, well, basically you'll hear where it doesn't sound like you, and you'll hear where it sounds forced, and you'll hear where it doesn't really make sense or doesn't complete a sentence or doesn't really make an impact statement. In the previous workshop today, I was just reading a paragraph I'd written as a sample cover letter, first paragraph, and when I actually read it out loud, it sounded terrible. When I wrote it, it sounded really great. So reading it out loud is going to help you, I think, really identify areas that you can tighten up or at least make more impactful, because you'll realize that you wouldn't say that in a conversation to someone, because they would look at you funny and go, yes, and what does that mean, right? So reading it out loud, I think, is a great skill to have. It'll sound weird for a while, but you can record yourself and play it back to yourself and just listen to it as well, just to get a sense of what that looks like. Step away and network isn't necessarily something that you can do today, but you can potentially put your resume down and look for other ways to gain insight into how you can talk about your skills, right? So if you're only thinking about yourself through the lens of yourself, it's hard to make a resume shift and be relevant to a different type of role that you've yet to have. But if you spend a lot of time speaking with people in the roles that you're excited by and listen to them talking about what they do and how they use their skills, it's actually going to give you a lot of good ideas about how you can talk about your experiences in a more relevant way. So stepping away and networking is a really helpful thing. Tweaking a bullet point and changing the spaces slightly probably won't make a really great impact, but using different language and focusing on different elements of your skills based on what you've learned from your networking is actually really important. This informational interviewing guide is a great way of structuring these conversations with people. There's a link to this guide in the link that I put in the chat, so you can find that. It tells you about how to reach out and the types of questions that you can ask. And these are some of the questions that I think can have an impact on your resume, right? So what are some of the skills that are most valuable in this role? And what are some of the situations where you get to use those? If you ask that question of people and listen to their responses, then you can say, well, how can I talk about my skills in similar ways? And that's going to be helpful. Robot-proof your resume. So our next session is on targeted resumes. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but this is the idea where you can scan the keywords from the job description and your resume, and you can see where there's a match and where there's not a match. And you can improve your resume based on how well your keywords match the job description. You don't want to be knocked out of contention because of software doesn't feel like you have the experience. You really want to make sure that your experience and the keywords are matching the job description that you're applying to. So that's going to be our next session in just a couple of minutes. You can actually do this for your resume in general. You can do this for an application that you're doing by using the job description. You can do this from your LinkedIn profile too, and we'll touch on all of these elements in that next session. And then definitely get some feedback from career services. I can't guarantee it will be this exciting having an appointment with us, but it's really helpful to get a third-person perspective or an objective perspective, because after a while, you get what is generally called sort of resume blindness, right? You've looked at your resume so many times that your brain is like, stop, I can't take it. And it's, your brain doesn't find it necessarily interesting because it's like, I know all this stuff. I've been there, I was there. But when we read it for the first time, we see different things from that you may not see. And the reason that you get resume blindness is because your brain is actually pretty smart and sometimes in an unhelpful way. If you are looking at this writing here and you can make any sense of it, imagine what that means when you're trying to find typos in your resume, or you're trying to make sure that all of your bullet points make sense, right? Because your brain is doing so much processing in the background that everything looks like it makes more sense after a while, because your brain knows what you were meant to say or what you wanted to say or what you hope to say. It doesn't actually spend a lot of time looking at what you did say. Same-day advising is great. Our appointments throughout our office are limited by our availability, lots of students needing us, but usually every day, every team has same-day appointments. You can find those on Handshake in the morning. Those are 50-minute sessions, really good for a quick resume review. I'll wrap up in this last few minutes just by a couple of resources. Again, these are all in the chat, the links that I put in the chat. The Learn How to Prepare Application Materials is a page on our website where we gathered together all of the resources that are particularly relevant to resumes. The Aurora platform for PhDs has a section on professional careers that is focusing on resumes. They have a how to modify your resume in 2 hours. So again, it's a today thing that you could do, as it were. They also have a cover letter one and a building your network, all of which we've covered today as being important parts of this process. The Vault resume guides give you another perspective. Again, they may say things that are slightly different from what I say, and that's fine because every hiring manager is different too, and they have their own perspectives about what a good resume looks like. Big Interview is our interviewing practice platform, but they do have a video and a written curriculum on writing resumes, so you can go through some of those videos as well, get another perspective.